Now, when it comes to working with that host element of an Angular component, there are two other things you should know about. And the first thing is that when it comes to adding properties to the host element, you can use this host setting on the component decorator object, and that is the preferred way of doing it. But alternatively, you can also add a property to your component class and name it class name, for example, and set the value you want to bind on your host element, so control in my case, and then decorate this with the host binding decorator, which must be imported from @Angular core. Now, what host binding will do is it will take a look at this property name, and it will then add it as a property to the host element and set this as a value for that property. Therefore, I can comment out host here and instead use host binding. Now, I technically don't want to use class name here, but class. And I could use it here, but to avoid any confusion with the built-in class keyword, we might want to use a slightly different property name here. And that's why host binding, this decorator, also takes an optional input, an optional argument, which allows you to define the actual property that should be bound as a string. So now the value here will be set as a value for this class property with help of host binding, even though the property name here is different. You only need this argument here though if you have a different property name than you want to bind. With that, if you reload, you got the same look as before, but now with host binding. That being said, using host binding is discouraged though. You should instead use the host property. This feature just exists for backward compatibility reasons because in the past it was a common way of setting those host properties. Nowadays, you should prefer this host property on the component decorator object. There also is a host listener decorator, which you can import and use, which allows you to bind a method to an event to which you want to listen here. Alternatively, you could add event binding here as well. And for example, listen to a click event, and then here define the method of the class that should be executed when that event occurs. So here, for example, we could add an onClick method and simply console log clicked. And if we want to trigger this whenever the host element is clicked, we can either do that by adding this value to our host object here in the component decorator. So I'm using that event binding syntax here, as you can tell. And then also as a string, I define the code that should execute when that click on the host element occurs. So here I'm telling Angular that it should execute the onClick method of this component. And if you do that and you comment out host listener for the moment, if you open your console here on the page, whenever I click into one of my controls, you see clicked gets logged here. So you can also listen to events on the host element by using this syntax, or, as I mentioned, alternatively with host listener. Then you would directly assign the method that should be triggered as a value here, though you then also must pass an argument to host listener and specify the event to which it should listen. So now you would be telling Angular that it should listen to click events on the host element and trigger that method whenever such a click occurs. With that, if I save this and reload, we also see that clicked output in the console as I click on those controls. So that again is an alternative to using this syntax. Now, I personally actually prefer this alternative. I think it looks a bit cleaner than defining this here, but the Angular team recommends this approach, which is why I'm showing it and recommending it to you here in this course. So that's how you could listen to events on your host elements. Of course, we now also have to make sure that this onClick method exists though, otherwise this will fail.